Usually when we talk about translation, there is this underlying assumption that we're dealing with a one-to-one exchange.
Yeah.
Like currency.
Right, like a simple transaction.
Yeah, exactly. You slide a dollar bill across the counter and you expect a very specific, like mathematically determined amount of euros to slide right back. It's supposed to be clean.
A simple substitution cipher. You swap the Sinhala vocabulary for English vocabulary. You fix up the grammar, and ideally, the cargo, I mean, the meaning it arrives on the other shore completely intact.
Right. But then you step into the world of poetry, and specifically poetry that is wrestling with memory, with, physical aging, with trauma. Suddenly that currency exchange is completely broken.
Oh, absolutely.
You aren't just moving nouns and verbs around. You are trying to port the heavy, visceral weight of human emotion across entirely different linguistic and cultural landscapes.
Which is incredibly difficult because the emotional resonance of a word in one culture might have literally zero equivalent in another. The cargo doesn't just shift during the voyage. Sometimes it changes shape entirely by the time it reaches the English language.
Yeah, that structural difficulty is exactly what we're wading into today. Welcome back to You, the Learner. Today's mission for our deep dive is unpacking a translated poetry collection. It was originally written in Sinhala by Nirasha Gunasekera, and it's titled Nostalgia.
It's a brilliant collection.
It really is. And the central question I just found myself obsessing over while reading this, the thing I really want to anchor our entire conversation on today, is this. How does a poet manipulate language to make us feel nostalgic for memories we haven't even lived?
Yeah, and it is such a fascinating question, mostly because of the collection's overarching duality.
Right.
I mean, it's titled Nostalgia, but anyone opening this book expecting some sepia-toned, comforting look at the past is going to experience a severe sensory
Oh,
whiplash.
total whiplash.
The nostalgia she presents is not a warm blanket. It is raw. It is painfully observant. And often, well, it operates almost ironically. The past here is rarely a place of comfort. It's usually an unresolved ache.
That is the exact feeling I got. I was reading this over the weekend, and it just places you in this incredibly specific, almost cinematic atmosphere.
Yeah.
You don't feel like you're reading a book. You feel like you are sitting in like a dimly lit corner booth of a cafe. The window is fogged up. It's probably raining. And you're just watching the world operate completely without you.
Well, you're touching on the poem The Cafe right there, where the narrator talks about actively sinking into solitude.
Right, right.
They watch other people drift into their own internal worlds, and the narrator is sipping a cappuccino, explicitly letting the heat of the drink burn its way down their throat and into their heart.
Yes. It's melancholic, but there's a streak of cynicism running through it, too. I mean, the narrator isn't just sad. They're actively dissecting the people around them.
And that dissection usually leads back to a painful realization about themselves.
Which perfectly leads me to A White Lady and a Sip of Wine. This piece, I actually had to put the book down for a second after reading it.
Oh, walk us through the mechanics of that one, because it perfectly illustrates that ambush of nostalgia we were just talking about.
Okay, so the narrator is sitting in a pub. They're observing a woman, the white lady of the title, and the narrator is drinking wine and they bite into an olive.
Right?
That sharp, astringent tang of the olive instantly triggers a memory. Suddenly the pub fades away, and the narrator is transported back to wandering under Werelou shades in the past, with their hands entwined with a lover.
And we should probably pause there just to contextualize Werelou for the listener.
Oh, good point.
A Werelou tree produces the Ceylon olive. It's native to Sri Lanka. So the narrator is in this pub, presumably somewhere in the West, biting into a Mediterranean olive, and that sharp taste creates a literal geographic taste clash in the mouth.
Yeah, the physical sensation just bridges two completely different continents and eras of their life. And that geographic displacement makes the ending so much more devastating. The memory floods back because of the sharp taste. But as the poem concludes, you realize it isn't the sharp sting of the olive or even the burn of the alcohol that actually wounds the narrator.
No, not at all.
It's the final detail. The thing that is ultimately unbearable is something incredibly soft as in life. It's the scent of lavender.
Because you can brace yourself against a sharp flavor, right? You can anticipate the burn of wine, but you cannot brace yourself against a soft scent.
You really can't.
A scent bypasses all your intellectual defenses. It just goes straight to the amygdala.
It's like leaning hard against a door you expect to be locked, only for it to swing wide open. You just fall right through. The nostalgia isn't something they are cultivating. It's like something that is hunting them.
And that hunted feeling, that sheer exhaustion, it requires a very specific poetic persona. Gunasekera establishes this early on in A Moon in a Ship.
Oh man, I kept returning to that poem. The personification is so intense.
It really is.
You have Luna, the moon, looking down at a lonely ship, asking how its day has been. And the ship responds that it has finally paused to catch its breath after endless miles battling the waves.
Right.
And then it mentions being bound to a rusted bollard. When I read that, I wondered, is the ship just tired from a long journey, or is this a broader metaphor for being fundamentally stuck?
I'd say it is definitely the latter. The ship isn't just resting. It is tethered to something decaying, that rusted bollard.
Yeah.
While the sailors are presumably below deck, warm in their cabins with their wives, the ship itself is left outside, cold and bound.
Just totally isolated.
Right. Gunasekera is using the inanimate world as a mirror for human exhaustion. But more importantly, it establishes the author's primary voice throughout the entire collection, which is the ultimate watcher.
The person on the periphery.
Precisely. The narrator in these poems is almost always slightly removed from the center of the action. They're standing off to the side, catching the microscopic details that everyone else is just too busy living to notice.
Right, yeah.
But this position of the watcher isn't just a thematic mood she's trying to set. The true brilliance of the collection is how that feeling of watching, of a gaze lingering and then snapping away, is built into the physical architecture of the poems themselves.
You mean the pacing? Because reading this, it feels like sitting in an editing bay with a master film director. The way time moves in these poems is incredibly elastic.
Yes.
It speeds up to a blur, and then it suddenly drops into extreme slow motion.
The cinematic pacing of her free verse. Where did you see that elasticity most clearly?
Definitely in Red, Amber, Green.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever read a poem that so perfectly captures the modern urban experience.
It's so visceral.
The rhythm of the lines literally mimics the ticking mechanism of a traffic light. At first, you have this chaotic parade of vehicles moving fast. Then the red light flares, the forward momentum halts.
The forced stillness.
Right, the forced stillness of the red light. And the narrator is sitting in their car, chewing their nails, just watching time drip away in this artificial pause.
And what happens in that pause?
In that stillness, the narrator looks in their rearview mirror and zeroes in on a woman in the car behind them. The camera lens just pushes all the way in.
Right.
The woman's fixing her hair. She's pressing her lips together to even out her lipstick. She's dusting powder on her cheeks. And then, right in that split second before the amber light flickers, the narrator catches the faint hum of an ABDA song drifting through the air from her car.
Wow.
And sees the woman's head swaying to the music.
It is a beautifully compressed micro-narrative. It is intensely intimate, yet it involves two people who will literally never actually speak to one another.
Never. And then the green signal hits, and the poem accelerates violently. Speed 100 kilometers per hour, a few seconds for everything. The intimacy is instantly shattered by the chaotic rush of traffic. The poem zooms back out.
It's masterful.
How is she physically controlling that speed on the page? I mean, on a technical level.
Largely through her mastery of enjambment and her incredibly deliberate deployment of silence.
Enjambment, right?
Yeah, so enjambment is when a poet breaks a line mid-sentence or mid-thought, forcing your eye to physically drop down to the next line before the thought resolves.
Got it.
When you combine that with visual spacing, strategic dashes, indentations, line breaks, the poet is essentially orchestrating your breath. They are telling your lungs exactly when to pause.
I noticed that specifically in the poem Jinn. The breathing feels very labored in that one.
Let's look at the mechanics of gin because it's a great example. The narrator is sitting by the beach. They have an ascot bottle. They are mixing London gin with sparkling water and tonic.
Very specific details.
Right, and the lines read, coughing Bristol smoke, meditating with open eyes, watching ships drift by.
There's a real lethargy to it.
Exactly, because of the commas at the end of each line. You are forced to stop. You take a breath right alongside the narrator who is exhaling that Bristol smoke. But the critical structural moment comes later. The poem shifts. When the waves crashed, the voices within trembled. I gulped gin no breaks and listened to the shaking within. Notice the dash after gin, and then how the line just trails off after within.
It just drops into white space.
Yeah, that white space is doing an immense amount of heavy lifting. The poem deliberately refuses to tell us what those trembling voices are actually saying.
Right.
The silence itself becomes a container for the unsaid trauma. The blank space on the page forces the reader to just sit in the discomfort of the narrator's internal shaking.
That word economy is staggering. She doesn't over-explain the trauma, she just builds a room around it and leaves you in there.
That's a great way to put it.
And she uses that exact same precision of language to completely subvert the reader's expectations in other ways, too. Like there's a poem called A Particular Waterfall.
Ah, yes. The critique of commodification.
Yes, but the way she sets the trap is so clever. For the first half of the poem, she builds up this majestic, highly anticipated tourist destination.
Building the hype.
Literally. She details the 400 or 500 kilometers you have to drive just to get there. She describes the wooden boundary fences you have to stand behind, which kind of reduces you to a spectator of nature.
Right.
She meticulously lists the top-notch facilities built around the site, the cafes, the spotless lavatories, the nursing spaces. It creates this grand romanticized expectation.
You fully expect a revelation of sublime natural beauty to follow all that buildup.
Exactly. You're waiting for the sweeping description of the roaring water. And then, amidst the flashing cameras and towering trees, she pivots hard. The actual waterfall is described as a silent, slender stream of urine down the cliff, sniffing ghostly cold on flat chips of stone.
It completely shatters the romantic illusion.
It is grotesque. I actually laughed out loud because it was so jarring. You drove 500 miles, you bought the overpriced latte at the cafe, you fought for a spot at the wooden barrier, all to photograph a rock wet with a trickle of water.
But look at the underlying mechanism of why that pivot works so well. She is weaponizing our own modern expectations against us.
What do you mean?
Well, we are conditioned to believe that if an experience is packaged with top-notch facilities and boundary fences, the experience itself must be profound. By reducing the waterfall to a stream of urine, she is offering a very sharp critique of how we commodify the natural world.
Oh, I see.
We don't actually want nature. We want the curated idea of nature, complete with a gift shop.
And when the actual nature fails to live up to the brochure, the absurdity of the whole endeavor is exposed. That makes so much sense. But, that jarring pivot from the beautiful to the uncomfortable, I don't think it's just a technical trick to make a point about tourism.
No.
The more I read, the more I felt like this constant undercutting of beauty reveals a deeply uncomfortable psychological layer to the entire collection.
You are stepping into the psychoanalytic architecture of the text now.
Yeah.
If you scratch even a millimeter below the surface of these cafes and traffic lights, you hit a dense vein of psychological inquiry. Gunasekera is constantly interrogating how the poetic self is constructed, and more often, how it is dismantled.
Help me understand how that construction works in the context of these poems. Because to me, it feels like the narrators are often defined not by who they are, but by who is looking at them.
That is precisely it. In Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, there is this fundamental idea that an infant only begins to understand itself as a separate, whole entity when it sees its reflection in a mirror.
Right, the mirror stage.
Exactly. Or more broadly, when it sees itself reflected in the gaze of the other. We figure out the boundaries of our own identity by how we are perceived by an external viewer.
We only know our edges by bumping into someone else's perception of us.
Beautifully put. Now, apply that to the poem, A Story Told by the Little Devil. This piece is narrated from the perspective of a model being painted by Leonardo da Vinci.
Right.
It is a brilliant exploration of power dynamics and the Lacanian gaze. The model is physically trapped in the studio, but more importantly, they are psychologically trapped in Leonardo's perception.
Oh, the poem has those lines. I am a prisoner of a wordless story, of a heart's signature, in this strange posture.
Yes, the model wants to break the pose. They want to leave the paintbrush, fetch the silver lyre, and just interact with the creator as a living human being.
But they can't.
No, they cannot. They are confined to the strange posture because their identity in that room exists solely to become an image on a canvas.
They literally say to Leonardo, "You're killing me softly."
Because the act of being immortalized in paint requires the erasure of the fluid, messy, living self. To be perfectly perceived by the other is a form of death. The subject is frozen. The tension between wanting to be truly understood and the suffocating reality of merely being seen is palpable.
That idea of erasure, of the self being annihilated by an external force, it brings a whole new context to what we discussed earlier with the poem Gin.
How so?
Well, the narrator drinks the gin with no breaks, not to numb themselves, but to listen to the shaking within. I actually read that as just raw emotional pain. But through this psychological lens, the alcohol isn't the numbing agent, it's a solvent.
The solvent, I like that.
They're using it to dissolve their own repression. But why? Why do we actively seek out the things that amplify the internal shaking?
Freud would argue that this is the repetition compulsion, a manifestation of the death drive.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, we repress what traumatizes us to survive, right? But the psyche cannot tolerate unresolved tension. It is constantly drawn back to the site of the wound, attempting to master the trauma by re-experiencing it.
So they're picking at this gap.
Exactly. The narrator in Jinn is forcing themselves to listen to the repressed voices because the silence of avoidance has become more agonizing than the trauma itself.
That makes total sense. The psyche is a closed system. The energy has to go somewhere.
Yeah.
And we see that energy manifest as massive projection in the poem, a poem thrown away.
Ah.
This one is so psychologically complex, it honestly felt like reading a clinical case study.
The poem concerning the lost love living in the distant village, right?
Right. So the premise is that the narrator is imagining the current life of a former lover, someone who mistakenly thrown away a poem the narrator wrote for them in circular lettering.
Right.
But it is the specific details of how the narrator imagines this lost love's life that really shocked me. They don't just imagine her being sad. They imagine a grueling, almost torturous domestic reality.
Detail it for the learner. What does the projection actually look like?
The narrator pictures her bathing multiple children, cooking rice over a hot fire, washing clothes in a small, muddy creek. They imagine her developing painful bunions on her feet.
Very harsh imagery.
And worst of all, dealing with a deeply flawed husband. The poem reads, reeking of foul tongue eyes, swollen, smelling of moonshine. And the former lover is reduced to applying coconut oil to the corns on this drunk man's feet. It is incredibly bleak.
It is. And you have to ask yourself, why does the narrator construct this specific reality? The narrator has no actual idea how this woman is living.
None at all. They're just completely inventing it.
They're inventing it as an ultimate ego defense mechanism. Think about the alternative. If the narrator imagined the lost love living a joyous, fulfilling, prosperous life without them, the resulting feelings of inadequacy and abandonment would completely shatter the narrator's ego.
Basically validate the rejection.
Precisely. So the psyche protects itself by engaging in a profound projection of misery. By constructing this tragic alternate reality where the woman is suffering terribly, the narrator is subconsciously self-soothing.
Oh, wow.
The internal logic basically becomes, it is a good thing we did not end up together because she was destined for a miserable, wretched life anyway. The poem is a masterpiece of self-deception rendered in beautiful verse.
That is so dark. I initially read it as a genuine expression of pity, but you're right, it's totally self-serving. It's a defense mechanism. And speaking of defense mechanisms that cross over into the grotesque, we have to talk about Marilyn Monroe, You and I.
Oh, arguably the most visceral piece in the entire collection.
Easily. The setup is that the narrator is observing a partner who has developed a toxic, all-consuming obsession with becoming a Hollywood icon.
Right.
They spend hours standing before the mirror, obsessing over a sleeveless white silk dress. But then it escalates into something straight out of a psychological horror film.
It really does.
The narrator addresses the partner asking, do you remember those nights of quiet experiments? Pinpoints were dipped in beakers of nitric acid and let it sizzle on your skin just below left cheek above those light lips.
The imagery is incredibly distressing.
It's literal self-mutilation. The partner is burning a permanent Marilyn Monroe beauty mark into their own face with acid. And the narrator has to sit there and watch the acid sizzle on their partner's skin.
And here we see the Freudian concept of the idealized ego taken to its absolute most destructive extreme.
Right.
The partner in the poem is so entirely consumed by the desire to embody this impossible external ideal, the manufactured icon of Monroe, that they view their own natural body as an obstacle.
The body is just in the way.
Exactly. The physical self must be violently destroyed, burned away with nitric acid, just to make room for the artificial identity.
And the collateral damage is immense. The poem mentions the children scattering and hiding in corners because the Monroe obsession has poisoned the entire household. It is a terrifying depiction of an identity completely collapsing.
And to handle themes that dark self-mutilation, deep repression, the disintegration of the ego, it requires a poet with absolute unwavering confidence in their own voice. If the writing were hesitant, these poems would feel melodramatic or, overly edgy. But they don't.
No, they feel incredibly grounded, which is a real testament to Gunasekera's raw talent. I was constantly trying to pin down her influences, but the range of cultural touchstones she draws from is just dizzying.
The breadth is amazing.
In one breath, you are immersed in deeply localized Sri Lankan imagery. There's the poem dedicated to the Jaffna mango tree, detailing the maggot-infested fruit that only one specific person loves. There are casual references to the Thisawaywa Reservoir, to the Mahamaya.
And for context for our learner, Thisawaywa is an ancient, historically massive reservoir in Anuradhapura, Sri Lanka. It was built in the 3rd century BC, so it carries immense historical and cultural weight regarding civilization and sustenance.
Right, so you have this ancient, monumental Sri Lankan imagery.
Yeah.
And then, seamlessly, you flip the page, and you are in a completely different world.
Oh, yeah.
You are analyzing the brushstrokes of Frida Kahlo, or you're sitting at a traffic light listening to the Swedish pop of ABEB, or you're watching paddle boats churning the water on the Murray River in Australia.
She builds a lexicon that absolutely refuses to be confined by geography. She pulls from a global repository. But this incredible breadth of imagery raises an interesting question about her creative process.
What do you mean?
Well, when you read a poem that swings from a 3rd century Sri Lankan reservoir to nitric acid in a modern beaker, does it feel to you like this voice is purely instinctive? Like, is she just channeling raw emotion onto the page, or is this a highly controlled architectural construction?
Oh man, I kept going back and forth on this. Because the emotions, the grief, the longing, the horror, they feel so immediate. It is very tempting to categorize it as purely instinctive. It feels like someone just bleeding onto a page.
Right.
But the deeper I read, the more I have to conclude that it is fiercely controlled. It is too structurally sound to be a spontaneous diary entry. But I don't know if I buy that the emotion is entirely manufactured either. Help me square that circle.
Well, I would define it as a masterclass in control, masquerading as instinct. The emotion is real, but the delivery system is meticulously engineered.
Give me an example of the engineering.
Okay, let's examine the poem Frida, which is ostensibly about the painter Frida Kahlo. On a surface read, it feels like a messy, passionate outburst of devotion. The narrator cries out, "You, only you, lovely aching Frida, made us weep on canvas." It has the cadence of a spontaneous emotional breakdown.
But you're saying it's not spontaneous.
Not in the slightest. If you trace the structuring of the imagery, it is ruthlessly paced to map sequentially onto the actual chronological trajectory of Kahlo's life.
Oh, really?
Yes. The poem begins with the physical wreckage and heartbreak inside the famous Blue House. Then it transitions to her public persona, the colorful smiles wrapped in Tahuana. From there, it moves into her sensuality and affairs, the tequila, the lips offered to men in sombreros.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Finally, it arrives at her physical confinement, the limbs enfeebled, tracing the world from the boundaries of a wheelchair.
So the poem is literally a biographical timeline disguised as a cry of the heart.
Exactly. The poet's hand is always firmly on the wheel. And you see that same absolute control in how she bridges the gap between abstract concepts and physical reality. Look at the poem Beaming Petals in a Henna Vine.
The one where the narrator is watching the Lebanese girls.
Yes. The narrator is older, likely middle-aged, and they are observing these beautiful, vibrant young Lebanese girls whose skin is adorned with gold, with striking green eyes.
Right.
The narrator is struck by the passage of time, but Gunasekera doesn't rely on a cliché. She doesn't write, "I felt old watching them," or "time is fleeting." Instead, she writes, "Oh, my age hurts."
She turns chronological time into a physical symptom.
She takes the entirely abstract concept of aging and renders it as an acute, localized physical wound. That ability to make the abstract tangible is the hallmark of architectural control over language.
That is so well said. And it's that exact control that allows her to manipulate the readers so effectively. Which brings me to a technique she uses that honestly messed with my head. Deliberate ambiguity.
Yeah.
And I usually hate ambiguity in poetry. Often it just feels lazy. It feels like the poet is just hiding the ball, refusing to be clear so that academics can project whatever meaning they want onto the text.
That is definitely the danger of ambiguity. It can easily devolve into obfuscation. But how is Gunasekera deploying it differently here?
She isn't using ambiguity to confuse the reader. She's using it to deliberately frame a false reality, only to completely pull the rug out from under you at the very end. She uses it to force a reevaluation of your own assumptions. The best example of this is A Story of Stairs.
Oh, walk us through the trap she sets in that one.
Okay, the setup is incredibly familiar. The narrator is climbing the stairs to their apartment. It's payday night, they've had a few drinks to take the edge off, and their arms are heavy with groceries. A very mundane, relatable urban scene.
We've all been there.
Exactly. And every time they climb these stairs, they glance over and see two tranquil eyes peering out from a window in another apartment.
A classic voyeuristic trope.
Right. I assumed I knew exactly what genre of poem I was reading. The narrator builds up this entire romantic fantasy about the woman behind the glass. They catch a glimpse of a soft smile, and the narrator thinks to themselves, would it be bad to catch up secretly, once in a while at least, and talk at ease?
You are completely lulled into this narrative of urban loneliness where two isolated souls might connect.
You accept the ambiguity of the tranquil eyes as a romantic mystery. But then comes the twist. The narrator is in their dim room. They hear voices outside, and they step out onto the landing. They see a crowd of people helping this very woman down the stairs. The poem specifically details her two thin, frail legs, separate from the rest, taking a highly unsteady path. And then, following behind the woman, two other people are carrying a wheelchair down the stairs. The narrator remarks, one I had never noticed before.
The revelation is just devastating.
It changes the entire molecular structure of the poem. It completely paralyzes you as a reader. You are forced to immediately go back to line 1 and reread the text with this new information.
Everything means something different now.
Exactly. What we, and the narrator, interpreted as romantic distance, the tranquil eyes staying mysteriously behind the window, was actually physical confinement. She wasn't playing hard to get. She literally could not leave the room.
The ambiguity made you complicit in the narrator's superficial romanticization. And the final image, where the narrator looks back at the now locked and shuttered window the absence left behind, is suffocating.
It's a brilliant, punishing use of shifting interpretation, and she does it again in Goldilocks. That one broke my heart even more.
Because it starts with such a lighthearted, almost flippant tone.
It reads like a coming-of-age story. The narrator is talking about a friend who is completely infatuated with a girl's curly golden hair. They hang around roadsides waiting for her to pass, they meet for pints on Fridays, and the friend is constantly muttering of golden locks.
Right, very youthful.
Gunasekera even writes, meaningless chatter nets entangled us. So you, as the reader, categorize this as superficial, fleeting young love, just kids being obsessed with appearances.
You accept the ambiguity of the boy's feelings as simple teenage infatuation.
But then, a stanza break occurs. Years pass. The friends grow older, the golden locks fade from everyone's memory. Until one dripping cold day, the narrator sees that same friend standing at a bus stop outside a hospital.
And the girl from their youth steps out of a car.
Yes. She leans on him, she offers a playful smile, but she is described as shrunken-eyed. And the poem ends with a devastating 3-word gut punch. Pardon the cliche, but it is a severe emotional drop. Perfect bald woman.
Wow.
It shattered me. The entire premise of the preceding stanzas is flipped. The boy wasn't just superficially obsessed with her hair. It was a profound, enduring, tragic loyalty. He stayed with her through an illness that stole the very physical attribute he supposedly loved her for. The ambiguity tricked us into judging him as shallow, only to reveal incredible depth.
These massive emotional swings are undoubtedly the engine of the collection. They demand active engagement. You cannot read these poems passively without falling into the traps she sets.
You really can't.
However, while we are praising the emotional architecture, we should probably also open the door to a broader critique of how the text functions at the granular level, especially considering we are engaging with a translated work.
Let's do that. Because honestly, no collection is flawless, and I did hit a few speed bumps. But before I critique, I want to reiterate that the absolute standout strength of nostalgia is its radical empathy.
Oh, without a doubt.
The capacity of this poet to step entirely out of her own perspective and inhabit the pain of another is staggering. The Song of a Black Swan is the pinnacle of this.
A very quiet, very observant piece.
You have this picturesque scene at a lake. White swans are gathering, eagerly pecking at bread crusts, being thrown by a group of happy, energetic children. And then off to the side, you have a lonely child confined to a wheelchair, locked against the slope of the bank.
Right.
This child isn't throwing bread, they are tearing petals from a withered lily and dropping them into the dark water. And when the 100th petal falls, the child lifts his gaze and finds the one solitary black swan gliding silently away from the flock.
The resonance there is unbelievable.
A way it captures the profound isolation of disability and how the child instantly identifies with the only other singular different creature on the lake. The emotional resonance is flawless.
The empathy is the load-bearing pillar of the entire book. But what were the speed bumps you encountered?
It comes back to the translation. Because this is moving from Sinhala to English, I notice moments where the language feels clunky.
Clunky how?
There are sudden shifts in register that feel jarring. For instance, in the poem Two Worlds, the narrator uses the phrase docile to the slightest breeze. That is highly formal, almost classical English phrasing.
Right.
But in the very next line, they talk about tickling the goldfish garden. Moving from docile to tickling in the span of a breath feels like a mismatch. Is this just a symptom of a slightly awkward translation? Are we losing a Sinhala colloquialism that simply doesn't have an elegant bridge into English?
It is a vital question when assessing world literature. Translating poetry is a nightmare of compromises. You aren't just moving definitions, you're trying to port cadence, idiomatic rhythm, and centuries of cultural association that might not exist in the target language.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That slight friction in register the bump between the elevated docile and the playful tickling could certainly be an artifact of a translator struggling to find the perfect equivalent.
Right, like seeing the stitching on the inside of a garment.
However, let me offer an alternative framework for reading those clunky moments. We might be looking at a feature, not a bug.
Really? How so?
Consider the core themes we've discussed. The title is nostalgia. The narrator is the ultimate outsider, the watcher. They are chronically alienated in the cafe at the tourist waterfall, in the pub with the olive. The speaker is constantly out of step with their environment.
True.
So having the language itself occasionally feel slightly displaced, slightly out of register, actually creates a textual mirror of the psychological displacement of the speaker. The awkwardness of the English phrasing forces the reader to feel the alienation the narrator is experiencing.
I don't know if I buy that entirely. I appreciate the literary theory, but are we just giving the translation too much credit?
It's possible.
If a word feels out of place and breaks the rhythm of the poem, maybe it's just a poor word choice. I feel like sometimes academics try to invent profound reasons for simple errors.
That is a completely fair pushback. There is always a danger of over-intellectualizing a flaw to protect a text we otherwise admire. If the shift in register pulls you out of the emotional reality of the poem, then the translation has failed in that specific moment, regardless of whether it accidentally mirrors the theme of alienation.
Yeah.
The friction must be productive, not merely distracting.
And I think that friction speaks to the delicate balance the collection is trying to strike.
Yeah.
Between surface-level accessibility and intellectual depth. On a purely literal level, these poems are highly accessible.
Very much so.
You do not need a master's degree in literature to visualize a traffic light, or a woman fixing her makeup in a rearview mirror, or someone drinking gin on a beach.
But as we've uncovered with our explorations into Lacanian mirrors and Freudian ego defense mechanisms, beneath those very recognizable everyday surfaces are abysses of psychological complexity.
Right.
The accessible setting is the bait. The intellectual depth is the hook.
And that balance is exactly why this collection has lingered in my mind for days. As we pull back and look at the journey we've taken today, moving from those quiet, lonely cafes to the intense horrors of acid burns and psychological repression, the ultimate impact of nostalgia is that it permanently alters how you view your own surroundings.
It really does.
You close this book, you walk outside, and you can't just look at a ticking traffic light or a rusted bollard or a drop of rain the same way again. You start seeing the invisible ghosts of human experience tethered to every mundane object.
And if we attempt to situate Gunasekera within the broader landscape of contemporary poetry, she emerges as a vital, defiant voice.
Defiant is a good word for it.
She refuses to be localized to a single cultural experience. She proves, poem after poem, that the coordinates of human suffering, grief, aging, the desperate desire to be seen are universal. It fundamentally does not matter if you are deep underground in a claustrophobic, terrifying environment, like the narrator in The Canary in a Coal Mine, worrying about toxic gas and the fragility of your daughter's future.
Or if you are standing on a rain-slicked, neon-lit street in Australia, watching a girl strip the heavens down, like in To the Mademoiselle I saw on the Swanston Street. The external architecture changes, but the internal human condition, the yearning, remains identical.
Precisely. Her work is a testament to the necessity of translation itself. Despite the hurdles, despite the occasional clunky register or lost idiom, we must translate these works because the emotional truths they contain belong to everyone.
I want to leave you, the learner listening to this, the final provocation to carry with you today. It is drawn from one of the quieter but perhaps most haunting poems in the entire collection, titled My Mother's Jewelry Box.
A masterclass in the symbolism of absence.
In this poem, the narrator is examining the thin glass bangles that her mother brought with her when she first arrived as a bride. Over the span of years and hardships, most of those glass bangles shattered.
Right.
The poem details how her mother meticulously tried to piece together the shards, trying to reconstruct what could never be whole again. And yet, despite the physical destruction, on quiet, sleepless nights, the narrator still hears the soft, delicate jingling sound of them.
Beautiful.
The poem concludes with these lines, "Most are broken, but the music remains unchanged."
It is an image that perfectly encapsulates the endurance of memory over physical reality.
So, as you go about your day, think about the physical architecture of your own life. Look closely at the objects you have kept over the years, not for what they practically do or what they are objectively worth, but for the profound absence they represent.
Yeah.
If a poet like Gunasekera were to sit in a dimly lit corner and write a poem exclusively about the broken things you refuse to throw away, what story would those fragments tell about you?
That is a question that will absolutely linger long after the audio stops.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the poetic mind. Keep looking for the unseen details in the periphery and keep exploring the heavy spaces between the words.